My wife and I went to a business meeting with an Arab man. I stayed quiet and pretended not to know his language, but then I heard her whisper something that made me freeze. At that very moment, I went to the bathroom and made a call. When I came back, 17 black cars were in front of the restaurant. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Vincent, and at 58 years old, I thought I knew everything about my wife, Angela. We had been married for 12 years, and she was everything I believed I wanted in a partner. Elegant, sophisticated, always perfectly dressed for every business function. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had this way of making everyone in the room feel important. I was proud to have her by my side. That Tuesday evening in October, we were heading to Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, for what Angela called a crucial business meeting. She had been particularly excited about this one, spending hours getting ready, choosing a navy blue dress that she said made her look professional yet approachable. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such a dedicated business partner in life. "Vincent, this could change everything for us," she said as we walked into the restaurant, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The place was dimly lit, with warm amber lighting that made the gold accents on the walls shimmer. "Mr. Al-Rashid is one of the most influential businessmen in the Middle East. If we can secure this deal, we're talking about contracts worth millions." I nodded, adjusting my tie nervously. At 58, I had built a successful consulting firm that specialized in government contracts, but I had never dealt with international clients of this magnitude. Angela had assured me she had the connections and experience to handle this level of business. She had been the one to arrange this meeting, claiming she had met Mr. Al-Rashid at a conference in Dubai 6 months earlier. Mr. Al-Rashid was already seated at a corner table when we arrived. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing an expensive gray suit and a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. He stood to greet us with a warm smile, shaking my hand firmly before kissing Angela's hand in a gesture that seemed both respectful and familiar. "Vincent, so wonderful to finally meet you," he said in accented but perfect English. "Angela has told me so much about your work. I understand you have contracts with several government agencies." "Yes, primarily defense and infrastructure projects," I replied, settling into my chair. The leather was soft and expensive, the kind that made you sink in slightly. "We've been fortunate to build strong relationships over the years." Angela smiled brightly, placing her hand on my arm. "Vincent is being modest. His firm has handled contracts worth over $50 million in the past 5 years alone. He's exactly the kind of partner you're looking for." As the evening progressed, we discussed potential collaborations. Mr. Al-Rashid explained that his company was looking to expand into American markets, particularly in areas where they could leverage my existing government connections. The conversation flowed smoothly, with Angela translating occasional Arabic phrases that Mr. Al-Rashid would slip into his speech, apologizing each time for reverting to his native language. "Sometimes when I get excited about business, I forget not everyone speaks Arabic," he chuckled after one such instance. "Not a problem at all," I said, smiling. What neither of them knew was that I understood every single word he had said. I had learned Arabic during my military service 30 years ago. It wasn't something I advertised. In fact, very few people knew about it, including Angela. I had served in the Middle East for 2 years, and the language had become second nature to me. But after I returned home and started my business, I rarely had occasion to use it. It seemed like ancient history, a skill that had no place in my current life. As the main course arrived, a perfectly prepared salmon for Angela, grilled chicken for me, and lamb for Mr. Al-Rashid, the conversation took on a more personal tone. Angela was charming, asking about his family, his travels, his interests outside of business. She had this way of making people feel like they were the most fascinating person in the room. "Your wife is remarkable," Mr. Al-Rashid said to me, raising his wine glass. "Beautiful, intelligent, and clearly passionate about business. You're a lucky man." "I certainly am," I agreed, though something in his tone made me slightly uncomfortable. There was an intimacy in the way he looked at Angela that seemed inappropriate for a business meeting. About an hour into dinner, Angela excused herself to take a phone call. "Work never stops," she said apologetically, stepping away from the table. Mr. Al-Rashid and I continued talking about logistics, timelines, potential contract values, the regulatory environment for foreign companies working with U.S. government agencies. When Angela returned, she seemed more animated than before. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, and she kept fidgeting with her jewelry, a nervous habit I recognized from our early dating days. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Perfect," she said, but her smile seemed forced. "Just some last-minute details for another project." As we moved into dessert and coffee, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Mr. Al-Rashid ordered a cognac, and Angela suggested we all have one to celebrate what she called the beginning of a beautiful partnership. The conversation drifted from business to travel, and both Angela and Mr. Al-Rashid shared stories about various Middle Eastern cities they had visited. It was then that Angela leaned closer to Mr. Al-Rashid, ostensibly to show him something on her phone. But what she actually did was whisper something in Arabic, so quietly that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But I heard every word. "Hatha sayakun akhir liqa lahu ma'ana. Ba'd usbu'ain, sayakun mittu wa sa'akun ganiyatan jiddan." The words hit me like ice water in my veins. She had just told him, "This will be his last meeting with us. In 2 weeks he will be dead and I will be very rich." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my expression neutral. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my coffee cup, the porcelain feeling cold against my fingers. Angela was planning my death. My wife of 12 years, the woman I trusted with everything, was casually discussing my murder over dessert. Mr. Al-Rashid nodded almost imperceptibly and whispered back, "Hal anti muta akida min al-khutta?" "Are you sure about the plan?" he had asked. Angela's response was barely audible, but I caught every syllable. "Na'am, kullu shay murattak. Sayabdu wa ka'annahu qalb. La yastati'a ahad ithbat shay." "Yes, everything is arranged. It will look like a heart attack. No one will be able to prove anything." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself while maintaining the facade that I was simply enjoying my coffee. They were planning to kill me and make it look natural. How long had this been in the works? How long had Angela been plotting against me? I glanced at my wife, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw past the beautiful facade. There was something cold in her eyes, something calculating that I had somehow missed all these years. Or maybe I had seen it and chosen to ignore it, too blinded by what I thought was love. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "I need to use the restroom." I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and made my way across the restaurant. The bathroom was empty, thankfully, and I locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I needed help, and I needed it now. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Detective Sarah Morrison had been a friend since college, and she now worked with a federal task force that dealt with international crimes. If anyone would know what to do in this situation, it would be her. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Vincent, this is unexpected. It's been, 2 years since we last spoke?" "Sarah, I need your help," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think my wife is trying to kill me, and I have proof." There was a pause. "Vincent, that's a serious accusation. Are you somewhere safe right now?" "I'm at Romano's downtown. She's here with someone, and I just overheard them planning my death. They don't know I understand Arabic." "Arabic?" Sarah's voice became sharper, more professional. "Vincent, can you repeat exactly what you heard?" I told her word for word what Angela and Mr. Al-Rashid had said. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing on a keyboard. "Vincent, I need you to listen carefully. Stay calm, go back to that table, and act like nothing happened. Can you do that?" "I think so." "Good. Whatever you do, don't let on that you understood what they said. We're going to need you to be our eyes and ears until we can get there." How much longer do you think you'll be at the restaurant? Maybe another 30 minutes. Perfect. Vincent, help is coming. Just hold on. I splashed cold water on my face and took several deep breaths. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who had just discovered that his entire life was a lie. But I also saw a man who was going to fight back. When I returned to the table, Angela looked up with what I now recognized as a completely fake smile. Feel better, honey? Much better, I lied, settling back into my chair. Mr. Al-Rashid was checking his phone, and Angela was stirring her coffee with an intensity that seemed unnecessary. We were just discussing the timeline for the project, Angela said. Mr. Al-Rashid thinks we could have preliminary contracts ready within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The same timeline they had mentioned for my death. I nodded and smiled, playing along with their charade while my mind raced with questions. How long had they known each other? Was this entire business meeting just a cover for planning my murder? And most importantly, why did they want me dead? The answer to the last question seemed obvious. Money. Angela would inherit everything if I died, and with my life insurance and business assets, she would be set for life. But there had to be more to it than that. The way she and Mr. Al-Rashid interacted suggested a relationship that went far deeper than a business partnership. Vincent seems quiet, Mr. Al-Rashid observed, and I realized I had been lost in thought. Just processing everything, I said. It's a lot to take in. If we move forward with this partnership, it will change the entire direction of my company. Change can be good, Angela said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. Her touch made my skin crawl. Sometimes we need to embrace new opportunities, even if they seem scary at first. I looked into her eyes, wondering how I had been so blind for so long. You're absolutely right, I said. Sometimes the biggest changes come when we least expect them. 25 minutes had passed since I called Sarah. I was starting to wonder if help was really coming when I saw movement outside the restaurant's large front windows. Cars were pulling up to the curb, one after another, until the street was lined with vehicles. They weren't ordinary cars. They were black sedans, at least 17 of them, each with the unmistakable look of government vehicles. My heart started racing again, but this time with relief rather than fear. I watched through the restaurant window as the 17th car pulled up to the curb, my coffee growing cold in my trembling hands. The black sedans formed a perfect line along the street, their tinted windows reflecting the amber glow from Romano's interior lights. Each vehicle looked identical, official, intimidating. Angela had noticed them too. "That's odd," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been concern. Her fingers drummed nervously against the white tablecloth, a rhythm that grew faster with each passing second. "Do you think there's some kind of event happening nearby?" Mr. Al-Rashid had gone completely still. His dark eyes were fixed on the cars, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Real, genuine fear that made the color drain from his olive complexion. "Perhaps we should ask for the check," he suggested quietly, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam from our coffee cups. I forced myself to appear calm, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "No rush," I said, taking a deliberate sip of my cold coffee. "The night is still young, and we haven't finished discussing the contract details." Angela's head snapped toward me, her green eyes wide with something between surprise and alarm. Throughout our 12 years of marriage, I had never been one to linger over business dinners. I was usually the first to suggest leaving, eager to get home to my study and my books, but tonight I needed to stay exactly where I was until Sarah's people were ready to move. "Vincent, maybe Mr. Al-Rashid is right," Angela said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle in the warm air. "We've covered everything we needed to discuss. We can handle the remaining details over email." Through the window, I saw men in dark suits stepping out of several cars. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents, spreading out to cover different positions around the restaurant. One of them, a tall woman with short brown hair, caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Sarah. Even after 2 years, I recognized her confident stride. Actually, there is one more thing, I said, leaning back in my chair. I'm curious about something, Mr. Al-Rashid. How exactly did you and Angela meet? She mentioned a conference in Dubai, but I'd love to hear your version of the story. The question hung in the air like smoke from the candles on our table. Angela's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and Mr. Al-Rashid's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a very brief meeting, he said carefully. Just a chance encounter at a networking event. How wonderful that such a brief encounter led to such a significant business opportunity, I continued, my voice conversational but my eyes sharp. Angela, you never mentioned that you were planning to attend conferences in Dubai. When did you develop such an interest in Middle Eastern business practices? She opened her mouth and closed it again, like a fish gasping for air. In all our years together, I had never seen Angela struggle for words. She was always quick with a response, always had a plausible explanation for everything. But now, faced with a simple question about a story she had presumably rehearsed, she was floundering. The company sent me, she finally managed. It was a last-minute opportunity. You were so busy with the Henderson contract, I didn't want to bother you with the details. The Henderson contract? I remembered that project well. It had taken place 14 months ago, not 6, and Angela had never mentioned any business trip to Dubai during that time. In fact, I distinctly remembered her being home every evening that month because she had been complaining about being bored while I worked late. As these thoughts raced through my mind, I began to piece together other inconsistencies from the past year. There were the mysterious phone calls that she would end abruptly when I entered the room, claiming they were from her sister in California. But I had spoken to her sister just last month, and she had mentioned how rarely she and Angela talked these days. There were also the sudden improvements to her wardrobe, designer dresses and handbags that seemed far beyond what our combined income could comfortably afford. When I had asked about them, she claimed she had found incredible deals at outlet stores, but the prices never seemed to add up. And then there were the changes in her daily routine. For 11 years, Angela had been predictably punctual, always home by 6:30 in the evening unless we had specific plans. But over the past 8 months, she had started staying out later, claiming new clients needed evening meetings or that traffic had been unusually heavy. Mr. Al-Rashid, I said, turning my attention back to our dinner companion. What type of business does your company primarily focus on? Angela mentioned government contracts, but I'd be interested to hear more specifics. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers playing with the gold cufflinks on his expensive shirt. We work in many sectors, he said vaguely. Import, export, consulting services. That's quite broad, I observed. In my experience, most successful international companies tend to specialize. What would you say is your primary area of expertise? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he glanced quickly at Angela before responding. We adapt to market opportunities. It was a non-answer, the kind of response someone gives when they're either hiding something or don't actually know what they're talking about. Combined with Angela's earlier nervousness and the whispered Arabic conversation I had overheard, I was beginning to suspect that this entire meeting was an elaborate facade. Through the window, I noticed that more agents had arrived. They were being discreet, positioning themselves casually on the sidewalk and in nearby doorways, but to my trained eye, their coordinated movements were obvious. Sarah had clearly taken my call seriously. You know, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket, I just remembered something. Angela, didn't you say you brought those contract templates we discussed? I'd love to show Mr. Al-Rashid our standard terms and conditions. Angela's eyes went wide with panic. I must have left them in the car, she stammered. I can go get them. No need to trouble yourself, I said smoothly. I have copies on my phone. Let me just pull up the documents. I made a show of scrolling through my phone, but what I was actually doing was sending a text to Sarah. Ready when you are. The response came back almost immediately. 2 minutes. Mr. Al-Rashid was growing more agitated by the minute. He kept glancing toward the restaurant's back exit, as if calculating whether he could reach it before the men outside moved in. Angela was gripping her napkin so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Actually," Mr. Al-Rashid said abruptly, "I just remembered I have another appointment this evening. Perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow?" "Of course," I said pleasantly. "But before you go, I have one more question. It's been bothering me all evening." Both of them froze, waiting for me to continue. "Earlier, when you were speaking Arabic, I thought I caught the word Kotl," I said, deliberately mispronouncing it slightly to maintain the fiction that I only recognized fragments. "In my limited understanding, doesn't that mean something like killing?" I hope I misheard. The silence that followed was deafening. Angela's face had gone completely white, and Mr. Al-Rashid's hand had started trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Angela said quickly. "We weren't discussing anything like that. You must have misheard." "I'm sure you're right," I said, but my eyes never left theirs. After all, what would two respected business people have to discuss about killing? That's when the doors opened and federal agents began filing into Romano's. The other diners looked confused as men and women in dark suits spread throughout the restaurant, but I felt nothing but relief. Sarah appeared at our table first, her badge clearly visible. "Vincent Holloway," she said formally. "Agent Morrison, FBI, we need to speak with you and your companions." Angela's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, fear, anger, and finally cold calculation. "I don't understand," she said, her voice high and strained. "What's this about?" "Ma'am, we need you to remain seated while we sort some things out," Sarah said calmly. Two more agents positioned themselves nearby, effectively blocking any escape routes. Mr. Al-Rashid had gone completely silent, his dark eyes darting between the agents and the exits like a trapped animal. The confidence and charm he had displayed earlier in the evening had vanished completely. "Vincent," Angela said, reaching for my hand across the table. "What's going on? Why are these people here?" I looked down at her manicured fingers touching mine, remembering all the times those same hands had caressed my face, prepared my meals, and signed anniversary cards with words of love. Now all I could think about was her whispered plan to make my death look like a heart attack. "I think you know exactly why they're here," I said quietly, pulling my hand away from hers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the woman I thought I had married. Vulnerable, frightened, almost childlike. But then something shifted behind her green eyes, and I saw the mask slip completely. "You son of a bitch," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You understood everything, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was written all over my face, and Angela could read it as clearly as I had read her Arabic death threats. As the agents moved in to take them into custody, I found myself thinking about all the signs I had missed, all the red flags I had ignored over the years because I wanted so desperately to believe in our marriage. But now, sitting in that restaurant surrounded by federal agents and watching my wife's true nature finally emerge, I realized that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. The interrogation room at the federal building was nothing like the ones you see in movies. It was sterile and windowless, with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly yellow. I sat across from Agent Morrison, who had shed her formal demeanor from the restaurant and now looked at me with the concerned expression of an old friend. "Vincent, I need you to walk me through everything," Sarah said, sliding a digital recorder across the metal table between us. "Start from the beginning. When did you first suspect something was wrong?" I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. The events of the evening had happened so quickly that I was still processing the magnitude of what I had discovered. Honestly, I think part of me knew something was off for months, maybe even longer, but I kept making excuses, telling myself I was being paranoid. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What kind of things did you notice?" "The money, for one thing," I said, remembering the designer clothes and expensive jewelry that had appeared in Angela's wardrobe over the past year. She started buying things that were way outside our budget. When I asked about it, she always had explanations. Sales, gifts from clients, bonuses from projects I wasn't involved in, but the numbers never added up. I paused, thinking about the credit card statements I had started reviewing more carefully about 6 months ago. Then there were the travel patterns. Angela claimed she was attending conferences and meeting with potential clients, but when I tried to verify some of these events online, I couldn't find any record of them. The supposed conference in Dubai where she met Al-Rashid? I searched every major business conference database. There was no matching event during the time frame she mentioned. Sarah made notes as I spoke. Did you confront her about these inconsistencies? I tried, but Angela was always so convincing. She would show me business cards from people she claimed to have met, or forward me emails that seemed to confirm her stories. Looking back, I realize how easy it would have been to fake all of that. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. I wanted to believe her, Sarah. After 12 years of marriage, you want to trust that your wife is telling you the truth. When did you start to actively investigate? Sarah asked. About 4 months ago. Angela had supposedly flown to Los Angeles for a client meeting, but her sister called, looking for her that same evening. When I mentioned that Angela was in L.A., her sister seemed confused. She said Angela had told her she was attending a business retreat in Colorado that week. That conversation with Angela's sister had been the turning point. I had hung up the phone with a growing sense of unease, and for the first time I had started to actively question my wife's explanations rather than simply accepting them. I started documenting things after that, I continued. I kept a journal of her claimed travel dates and cross-referenced them with any verifiable information I could find. I also started paying closer attention to her phone calls. Sarah's eyebrows rose. You monitored her communications? Not exactly, but I started noticing patterns. She would get calls at odd hours, sometimes as late as 2 in the morning, and she would always step outside or go to another room to take them. When she came back, she would claim it was work-related, but the time zones never made sense. If it was really a client in California calling at 2 a.m. Eastern Time, that meant they were calling at 11 p.m. Pacific. What kind of business call happens at that hour? I had started keeping track of these late-night calls in a small notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. The frequency had increased dramatically over the past 3 months, sometimes happening 3 or 4 times per week. There was also the language issue, I said. Angela claimed she was working with more international clients, which is why she was supposedly improving her Arabic and learning some new Middle Eastern business customs. But the Arabic phrases she would practice around the house were strange. Sarah looked up from her notes. Strange how? They weren't business terms. I recognized some of them from my military service, and they were more like coded language, references to packages and deliveries and eliminating obstacles. At the time, I convinced myself she was probably just learning random vocabulary, but now, realized she was practicing the terminology she needed for whatever she was really involved in. The weight of my own naivety was crushing. How many red flags had I ignored because I didn't want to face the possibility that my marriage was built on lies? Vincent, Sarah said gently, I need to tell you something about what we've discovered in the past few hours since we brought Angela and Al-Rashid into custody. I braced myself, sensing that whatever she was about to tell me would be worse than anything I had imagined. Your wife isn't just involved in a plot against you personally. She's been running a sophisticated corporate espionage operation for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The words hit me like a physical blow. Corporate espionage? Angela has been using her relationship with you to gain access to classified government contract information, which she then sells to foreign competitors. Your security clearance and your firm's reputation gave her access to bid details, contract specifications, and strategic planning documents that are worth millions on the black market. I felt sick. Every time I had shared details about my work with Angela, every time I had brought home documents to review in my home office, every casual conversation about upcoming projects, she had been memorizing it all, cataloging it, selling it to the highest bidder. How long have they known? I asked weakly. We've been tracking this network for 8 months, Sarah said. Angela first came to our attention when we noticed irregularities in some major defense contract bids. Foreign companies were submitting proposals that were suspiciously close to the classified specifications, sometimes matching them almost exactly. We started looking for the source of the leak. She pulled out a thick folder and opened it on the table between us. Inside were photographs, financial records, and what looked like surveillance reports. Al-Rashid isn't just a businessman, Vincent. He's a broker who facilitates the sale of stolen industrial and government intelligence to Middle Eastern corporations. Angela is one of several assets he's been running in the U.S., but she's by far his most valuable because of her access to your work. I stared at the photographs in the folder. There were images of Angela meeting with various men in hotel lobbies, restaurants, and parking lots. In one photo, she was handing a manila envelope to someone I didn't recognize. In another, she was sitting in a car with Al-Rashid, their heads close together as they examined what looked like documents. "The money she's been spending isn't from increased income," Sarah continued. "Over the past 2 years, she's received payments totaling over $400,000 from various shell companies connected to Al-Rashid's network." $400,000. I thought about our joint bank account, which showed no record of such deposits. Angela had clearly been maintaining separate, financial accounts that I knew nothing about. "There's something else, Vincent. Something that directly threatens your life." I looked up from the photographs, my mouth dry with dread. "Angela's usefulness to this network was coming to an end. Your firm is about to lose its security clearance due to an unrelated government audit, which means she would no longer have access to the kind of information that makes her valuable. But if you were to die suddenly, she would inherit your life insurance and business assets, which total approximately $1.2 million. The room seemed to spin around me. "So, killing me serves 2 purposes." "Exactly. It gives her a substantial payout that she can take overseas, and it eliminates the one person who might eventually discover her activities. We have evidence that she was planning to disappear within a month of your death, probably to a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States." Sarah showed me another document, a rental agreement for a safety deposit box that Angela had opened 6 months ago under a false name. Inside, agents had found over $50,000 in cash, along with a fake passport and identity documents. "She's been planning this for a long time, Vincent. The murder plot wasn't a sudden decision. It was the final phase of a very calculated exit strategy." I sat in silence, trying to process the scope of Angela's betrayal. It wasn't just that she had been unfaithful or even that she had been stealing from me. She had turned our entire marriage into an elaborate con game, using my love and trust as weapons against not just me, but against my country's security. "How were you planning to kill me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out another folder. "Based on our surveillance and the conversations you overheard tonight, they were planning to use a synthetic compound that mimics the symptoms of cardiac arrest. It's virtually undetectable in standard autopsy procedures, especially in a man your age with a family history of heart disease." My family history. Angela knew that my father had died of a heart attack at 59 and that my grandfather had suffered a similar fate. If I died suddenly of apparent cardiac arrest, no one would think to look for foul play. "The compound would have been administered gradually over several days through your food or drinks," Sarah continued. "You would have started feeling fatigued and short of breath, symptoms that would be consistent with stress or overwork. By the time you collapsed, it would have been too late for medical intervention to save you." I thought about the strange taste I had noticed in my coffee the past few mornings, a slightly bitter aftertaste that Angela had dismissed as a problem with our water filter. Had she already started poisoning me? "Vincent, we need you to know that you're safe now," Sarah said, reaching across the table to touch my arm briefly. "We've searched your house and found no traces of any toxic compounds, which suggests that they hadn't started the final phase of their plan yet. The conversation you overheard tonight was probably them finalizing the timeline." 2 weeks. They had said 2 weeks, which meant I had unknowingly been living on borrowed time. "What happens now?" I asked. Now we build a case that will put them away for a very long time, Sarah said grimly. Corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, money laundering. We're looking at federal charges that carry sentences of 25 years to life. As I sat in that sterile interrogation room, surrounded by evidence of my wife's elaborate betrayal, I realized that the man I had been when I woke up that morning no longer existed. That man had been naive, trusting, and fundamentally ignorant about the woman he shared his bed with. The man I was now would never be so foolish again. 3 hours after my world had collapsed at Romano's restaurant, I sat in another sterile room, this one with a one-way mirror that I knew was being observed from the other side. Agent Morrison had explained that Angela had agreed to speak with me, though she had been warned that anything she said could be used against her in court. I wasn't sure why I had agreed to this meeting. Part of me needed to hear her explanation, to understand how the woman I had shared a bed with for 12 years could have plotted my death with such casual indifference. The door opened, and Angela walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to drain the color from her face. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, and her usually perfect hair hung limp around her shoulders. For a moment she looked like a stranger, but then our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of the woman I thought I knew. "Vincent," she said softly, settling into the chair across from me, "I suppose you think you're very clever." Her tone caught me off guard. There was no remorse, no shame, no hint of the panic I had seen in her eyes at the restaurant. Instead, there was something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. "I think I'm very lucky to be alive," I replied evenly. Angela let out a small laugh that held no humor. "Lucky. Yes, I suppose that's one way to look at it." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of detached interest a scientist might show when examining a specimen. "You know, Vincent, you were always too trusting. It made you easy to manipulate, but it also made you boring." The casual cruelty in her voice hit me like a slap. 12 years, Angela. 12 years we were married. Was any of it real?" "Real?" She tilted her head, considering the question. "I suppose the first few months were real enough. You were a decent catch. Successful, stable, with good connections. I thought I could make a comfortable life with you while pursuing other opportunities on the side." Other opportunities. She was talking about our marriage like it had been a business arrangement, a stepping stone to something better. "When did it change?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "About 3 years in, I met someone who showed me how much more I could accomplish with the right guidance." Her eyes took on a distant look, and for the first time since entering the room, her expression softened slightly. "Khalil introduced me to a world where my intelligence was actually valued, where I could make real money instead of playing housewife to a middle-aged consultant. Khalil. Not Al-Rashid, but Khalil. Even his name had been a lie, just like everything else about this evening." "You mean he showed you how to sell government secrets?" I said. Angela's smile was sharp as a blade. "I mean he showed me how to capitalize on assets I already had access to. Your security clearance, your contacts, your complete lack of suspicion, it was all so incredibly useful." The matter-of-fact way she discussed betraying our country's security made my stomach turn. "And when the usefulness ran out, you decided to kill me." "Oh, Vincent," she sighed, as if I were a slow child who couldn't grasp a simple concept. "It wasn't personal. It was just the most efficient solution to multiple problems." Not personal. She was planning to murder me, and it wasn't personal. "What problems?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your firm is about to lose its security clearance, which means I would no longer have access to the kind of information that made our arrangement profitable. But more importantly, you were starting to ask questions." She leaned forward slightly, her green eyes sharp and focused. "That conversation with my sister about the Los Angeles trip, I knew you were becoming suspicious." So she had been aware of my investigation all along. I thought about all the careful notes I had hidden in my desk drawer, all the subtle questions I thought I had been asking. Apparently, I had been even more transparent than I realized. "How long have you been planning to kill me?" I asked. About 6 months, she said without hesitation. Once we realized that your usefulness was coming to an end, we started exploring exit strategies. The life insurance and business assets would give me enough money to disappear permanently, and your death would eliminate the only person who might eventually put the pieces together. The casual way she discussed my murder was more chilling than any emotion would have been. She had been living in our house, sleeping in our bed, cooking our meals, all while planning the most efficient way to end my life. The heart attack scenario was Khalil's idea, she continued. He said it would be poetic justice, the stressed businessman who works himself to death. No one would question it, especially given your family history. I thought about all the evenings she had expressed concern about my stress levels, all the times she had suggested I slow down and take better care of myself. Had that been part of the setup, laying the groundwork for my eventual natural death? You know what the truly beautiful part was? Angela's voice took on an almost dreamy quality. I would have been the grieving widow. People would have felt sorry for me, supported me through my loss. I could have played that role for months before quietly relocating overseas. The premeditation was breathtaking in its scope. She hadn't just planned my death, she had planned the entire aftermath, right down to the public sympathy she would receive. Did you ever love me, Angela? Even in the beginning? For the first time since entering the room, she seemed to consider her answer carefully. I thought I did, she said finally. You were kind to me, generous, attentive. For a while I thought maybe I could be satisfied with that kind of life. What changed? Her expression hardened again. I realized I was capable of so much more than being your wife. I'm brilliant, Vincent. I speak 4 languages fluently, I understand complex financial systems, I can read people and situations in ways you never could. But you wanted me to be content organizing charity dinners and hosting dinner parties for your business associates. I stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the resentment that had apparently been building for years. I never tried to stop you from pursuing your own career. You never encouraged it either, she shot back, her voice rising slightly. You were perfectly happy having me as an accessory to your success. The beautiful wife who spoke multiple languages and made you look cosmopolitan at business functions. There was truth in what she said, and it stung. I had been proud of Angela's intelligence and sophistication, but I had also been comfortable with her focusing primarily on supporting my career rather than building her own. So you decided to build a career selling government secrets, I said. I decided to use my talents in a way that actually compensated me for their value, she corrected. Do you have any idea how much money I've made over the past 3 years? Over $800,000, Vincent. More than your consulting firm makes in a good year. $800,000. Agent Morrison had mentioned $400,000, but apparently that was just what they had been able to trace so far. Money from betraying your own country. Angela shrugged as if patriotism were an outdated concept that didn't apply to people like her. Countries are just artificial constructs, Vincent. Business is global now. Information flows to whoever can pay for it, regardless of borders. The woman sitting across from me was completely unrecognizable from the person I thought I had married. Even her mannerisms were different, more confident, more predatory, more alive than she had ever seemed during our years together. Why are you telling me all this? Ah, asked. Your lawyer must have advised you to stay silent. Because I want you to understand something, she said, leaning forward again. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. You've just delayed the inevitable. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Did you really think Khalil was the only person I was working with? Did you think this was some small-time operation that would collapse just because you overheard one conversation? Her smile was predatory now, all pretense of civility abandoned. Vincent, you have no idea how big this is. I felt the blood drain from my face. You're lying. Am I? Ask your FBI friends how many other people they arrested tonight besides Khalil and me. Ask them how many of the shell companies they've been able to shut down. Ask them whether they think catching 2 small fish has ended this network. The confidence in her voice was terrifying because it rang true. If Angela and Al-Rashid were just small players in a larger organization, then exposing them might not have solved anything. It might have just made me a target for whoever else was involved. "You're scared," I realized. "Of course I'm scared," she snapped. "But not for the reasons you think. I'm scared because I know what happens to people who cooperate with federal investigators in cases like this. I'm scared because there are people out there who will see my arrest as a liability that needs to be eliminated." For the first time since entering the room, Angela looked genuinely frightened. The cold, calculating mask slipped, revealing something desperate underneath. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying that turning me in might have felt like justice, Vincent, but it might also be the stupidest thing you've ever done. Because now you're not just the man who discovered his wife's betrayal. You're the man who exposed an international intelligence operation." She stood up, the chains on her handcuffs rattling. "And that makes you a much bigger target than you ever were before." The guard knocked on the door, signaling that our time was up. Angela moved toward the exit, then paused and looked back at me one final time. "Sleep well, Vincent," she said with a smile that was pure malice. "If you can." As the door closed behind her, I sat alone in the sterile room, realizing that while I might have survived one threat to my life, I might have inadvertently created an even bigger one. The woman I had loved for 12 years was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't predict. And somewhere out there, other people who shared her complete lack of conscience were probably already planning their response to tonight's arrests. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a quiet suburb of Virginia, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business and nothing interesting ever happened. I had been living there for 6 weeks under federal protection, watching through reinforced windows as autumn turned the maple trees in the front yard from green to brilliant orange. Agent Morrison visited every few days with updates on the case, but mostly I sat in the furnished living room reading books and trying not to think about how completely my life had been dismantled. It was on a gray Tuesday morning in November that Sarah arrived with news that would change everything again. "Vincent, we need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from me with a thick manila folder in her hands. Her expression was serious, but there was something else there too. A hint of excitement that she was trying to suppress. "Is it about the trial?" I asked. Angela and Al-Rashid's court date was scheduled for the following month, and I had been dreading the prospect of testifying in open court about the details of my marriage and the espionage operation. "Actually, it's about something much bigger than the trial," Sarah said, opening the folder. Angela was right about one thing. She and Al-Rashid were small fish in a much larger operation, but what she didn't know is that we've been building a case against the entire network for over 2 years. She spread several photographs across the coffee table between us. I recognized some of the faces from the surveillance photos she had shown me weeks earlier, but others were new. "Your wife's arrest was the breakthrough we needed," Sarah continued. She had detailed records of her transactions, contact information for dozens of other operatives, and, most importantly, she had evidence of the network's financing structure. I picked up one of the photographs. It showed a man in his 50s sitting at an outdoor cafe, apparently unaware he was being photographed. "Who is this?" "Dr. Marcus Webb, professor of international relations at Georgetown University, also one of the network's primary recruiters in the Washington, D.C. area." Sarah pointed to another photo. "This is Elena Vasquez, a translator at the State Department. She's been passing classified diplomatic communications to foreign governments for 3 years." The scope of the operation was staggering. As Sarah explained it, the network had infiltrated government agencies, defense contractors, and academic institutions across the entire East Coast. They had been operating for at least 5 years, selling everything from military technology specifications to diplomatic intelligence to the highest bidders. "How did you figure out the connections?" I asked. "Angela kept meticulous financial records," Sarah said with something approaching admiration. "She documented every payment, every meeting, every piece of information she provided. She probably thought she was protecting herself, creating evidence that could be used for blackmail if necessary. But what she actually created was a roadmap of the entire operation. She showed me a complex organizational chart that looked like something from a corporate strategy meeting. Names were connected by lines indicating relationships, with dollar amounts marking the value of various transactions. At the center of it all was a name I didn't recognize: Dmitry Volkov. Volkov is the one who recruited Al-Rashid, who in turn recruited Angela, Sarah explained. He's Russian intelligence, but he's been operating independently for the past decade, selling information to anyone willing to pay his prices. He's the one Angela was really afraid of. I thought about the fear I had seen in Angela's eyes during our conversation at the Federal Building. Is he still out there? Not anymore, Sarah said with satisfaction. We arrested him yesterday morning at his estate in Maryland along with 15 other members of his network. The operation is completely dismantled. The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. For weeks I had been living with the knowledge that dangerous people might be planning to eliminate me as a security threat. Now suddenly, it was over. What happens now? I asked. Now we need your help with something, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. We want you to testify not just against Angela and Al-Rashid, but against the entire network. Your case is the thread that unraveled everything, and your testimony will be crucial in securing convictions. The prospect was daunting, but I felt a sense of obligation that went beyond my personal desire for justice. What would that involve? Several trials over the next 18 months, your testimony would focus primarily on how Angela used your relationship to gain access to classified information, but we might also need you to explain how the network operated from a victim's perspective. Sarah paused, studying my reaction. I won't lie to you, Vincent. This will be difficult. Defense attorneys will try to portray you as a naive husband who should have known what his wife was doing. They'll question your judgment, your competence, your patriotism. I had already been questioning all of those things myself for weeks. But it will help convict them. It will help convict all of them, she confirmed. And Vincent, there's something else you should know. The information this network sold led directly to the deaths of 2 American operatives overseas. This isn't just about money or embarrassment. People died because of what these people did. The weight of that revelation settled on me like a heavy blanket. Angela's betrayal hadn't just been personal or financial. It had cost lives. The woman I had shared breakfast with every morning for 12 years had blood on her hands. I'll do whatever you need, I said. Over the following months, I learned more about the network's operations than I had ever wanted to know. The trials were exactly as difficult as Sarah had predicted. Defense attorneys painted me as either a willing participant who was claiming ignorance to save himself, or as criminally negligent in failing to detect my wife's activities. Angela's attorney was particularly aggressive, suggesting that I had known about her work all along and had only turned her in when I realized the authorities were closing in. He presented a theory that I had been skimming classified information myself and using Angela as a go-between to avoid direct contact with foreign agents. Isn't it true, Mr. Holloway, the defense attorney asked during my cross-examination, that you specifically chose to hide your knowledge of Arabic from your wife so that you could monitor her activities without her knowledge? No, I answered firmly. I never told Angela I spoke Arabic because it never seemed relevant to our relationship. It was a skill I learned 30 years ago during military service that I rarely had occasion to use in civilian life. But it's quite a coincidence, isn't it, that the one time your wife chose to speak Arabic in your presence happened to be when she was discussing something incriminating. If you're suggesting I was somehow orchestrating my wife's espionage activities just so I could expose them, that's absurd, I replied. No one chooses to have their life destroyed for the sake of building a legal case. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen, methodically presented the evidence that Sarah and her team had gathered. Bank records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained deposits to accounts controlled by various defendants. intercepted communications detailing specific classified information that had been sold, testimony from foreign intelligence officers who had purchased American secrets through the network. Angela's trial was the most difficult for me to endure. Watching her sit calmly at the defense table, occasionally whispering to her lawyer or taking notes, was surreal. She looked like the woman I had married. But I knew now that the person I thought I had known had never really existed. When Angela took the stand in her own defense, she portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation by older, more experienced operatives who had taken advantage of her intelligence and ambition. She claimed that Volkov had threatened her family if she didn't cooperate, and that she had been trying to extract herself from the network when I discovered her activities. "I loved my husband," she testified, looking directly at me for the first time since our confrontation at the federal building. "I made terrible mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt Vincent. When I agreed to the plan to fake his death, I was planning to reveal the truth before any harm could come to him." It was a compelling performance, delivered with just the right amount of tears and remorse. If I hadn't heard her cold, calculating words during our private conversation, I might have believed her myself. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They presented evidence that Angela had been actively researching untraceable poisons months before her arrest. They showed bank records, indicating that she had transferred money to offshore accounts in preparation for disappearing permanently. Most damning of all, they played a recording of a phone conversation between Angela and Al-Rashid, where she discussed the specific timing of my murder with no hint of reluctance or coercion. "The defendant speaks of love," Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen said in her closing argument, "but love doesn't involve detailed planning for your spouse's murder. Love doesn't involve selling your country's secrets for personal profit. Love doesn't involve years of elaborate deception designed to exploit trust and intimacy for criminal purposes." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Angela showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but I saw her hands trembling slightly as the judge set a sentencing date. Similar scenes played out in courtrooms across the District of Columbia as other members of the network faced trial. Dr. Webb received 15 years for his role in recruiting and coordinating operatives within academic institutions. Elena Vasquez was sentenced to 12 years for selling diplomatic secrets. Al-Rashid, facing the most serious charges as a foreign operative, received 25 years in federal prison. Angela's sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning 8 months after her arrest. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and victims of the network's activities. I sat in the front row, watching as the woman who had planned my death learned her fate. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "you have betrayed not only your husband and your country, but the fundamental trust that holds our society together. Your actions led directly to the compromise of national security information and the deaths of American intelligence operatives overseas." He paused, looking down at the sentencing documents on his bench. "While the court acknowledges that you were not the mastermind of this operation, your role was central to its success, and your willingness to plan your husband's murder demonstrates a level of callousness that demands severe punishment." Angela was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me one final time. But instead of the malice I had seen in her eyes during our confrontation, there was something else, a kind of empty resignation, as if she was finally acknowledging the consequences of the choices she had made. 2 years after Angela's sentencing, I stood on the deck of my new home overlooking Chesapeake Bay, watching the sun set over water that stretched to the horizon. The house was smaller than the one I had shared with Angela, but it was mine in a way that our marital home had never been. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every photograph on the walls had been chosen by me alone, without considering anyone else's preferences or hidden agendas. The transition to this new life hadn't been easy. In the months following the trials, I had struggled with a mixture of anger, grief, and something that my therapist called betrayal trauma. I had mourned not just the end of my marriage, but the discovery that the relationship I thought I had been living for 12 years had been fundamentally different from the reality. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the trauma specialist the FBI had recommended, helped me understand that what I was experiencing was similar to what happened to victims of long-term psychological manipulation. "You're not just processing the end of a relationship," she had explained during one of our early sessions. "You're processing the discovery that your entire understanding of that relationship was constructed on lies." The hardest part had been learning to trust my own judgment again. If I could be so completely deceived by someone I lived with intimately for over a decade, how could I trust my ability to read people or situations accurately? For months I had second-guessed every interaction, every friendship, every business relationship, wondering what hidden motivations might exist beneath the surface. But gradually, with Dr. Carter's help and the passage of time, I had begun to rebuild my sense of self. I learned that Angela's ability to deceive me didn't reflect a fundamental flaw in my character, but rather her exceptional skill at manipulation. The FBI had called her one of the most sophisticated operatives they had ever encountered. Her deception had been professional grade, not something an ordinary person could reasonably be expected to detect. I had sold my consulting firm 18 months ago, unwilling to continue working in an industry where my reputation would always be tainted by association with Angela's crimes. The buyer, a larger consulting group based in Atlanta, had been surprisingly understanding about the circumstances and had offered me a fair price for the client contracts and business relationships I had built over 20 years. With the proceeds from the sale, along with the life insurance money I had never claimed and didn't feel entitled to, I had been able to purchase this waterfront property and retire comfortably at the age of 60. It wasn't the retirement I had planned, but it was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since before I met Angela. My days now followed a simple routine that I found deeply satisfying. I woke early and had coffee on the deck while watching the sunrise. I spent mornings reading history, biography, and mystery novels that I chose purely for my own enjoyment. Afternoons were for physical activity, walking along the shoreline, working in the garden I had planted behind the house, or taking sailing lessons from a retired naval officer who lived down the beach. Evenings were often spent with my neighbors, a community of retirees and remote workers who had chosen this quiet corner of Maryland for its natural beauty and slower pace of life. They knew my story. The trials had been widely covered in the news, but they treated me with kindness rather than pity and curiosity rather than suspicion. It was during one of these evening gatherings that I met Claire Hoffman, a widow in her mid-50s who had moved to the area after her husband's death from cancer 2 years earlier. She was a retired librarian with silver hair and laugh lines around her blue eyes, and she had a directness that I found refreshing after years of living with someone whose every word had carried hidden meanings. "So you're the man who caught the spy ring," she had said when we were introduced at a neighbor's barbecue. "That must have been quite an experience." "Not one I'd recommend," I had replied, and she had laughed. "I imagine not. But it takes courage to do what you did. A lot of people would have just ignored the warning signs." That conversation had led to others, and over the months that followed, Claire and I had developed a friendship based on honesty and mutual respect. She told me about her 30-year marriage to a high school principal, about the pain of watching him decline during his illness, and about her struggle to rebuild her identity as a single person after decades of being part of a couple. I told her about the slow process of learning to trust again, about the guilt I sometimes felt over missing warning signs that seemed obvious in hindsight, and about the strange mixture of relief and loss that came with discovering that someone you loved had never really existed. "The woman you loved was real," Claire had said during one of our long walks along the shore. "She was just incomplete. The parts of Angela that you fell in love with, her intelligence, her charm, her sophistication, those weren't fake. They were just being used for purposes you didn't understand." That perspective had been helpful in ways I was still discovering. It allowed me to acknowledge that my feelings during the marriage had been genuine, even if Angela's had been calculated. It let me honor the happiness I had experienced without feeling foolish for having been deceived. On this particular evening, as I stood on my deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 3 years ago, I had been a successful businessman living in suburban comfort with a wife I adored. I had thought I understood my place in the world and my prospects for the future. Now I was a 60-year-old retiree living alone on the Chesapeake Bay with a story that sounded like something from a spy thriller and a perspective on trust and deception that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I was also, for the first time in years, completely honest about who I was and what I wanted from life. The phone rang. Inside the house, interrupting my contemplation. It was Agent Morrison, calling with her monthly update on the imprisoned members of the espionage network. "Vincent, I hope I'm not interrupting your dinner," Sarah said. Her voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship that had developed between us over the past 3 years. "Not at all. What's the news?" "Dmitry Volkov died in prison yesterday. Heart attack, according to the medical examiner. He was 68 and had a history of cardiac problems, so it appears to be natural causes." I felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Volkov had been the mastermind of the operation that had destroyed my marriage and nearly cost me my life. But his death also represented the final closing of a chapter I was ready to leave behind. "What about the others?" I asked. "Angela is adjusting to prison life, according to reports from her facility. She's been working in the library and apparently teaching English as a second language to other inmates. Al-Rashid is in solitary confinement after several incidents with other prisoners who don't appreciate foreign operatives." The image of Angela teaching other prisoners was somehow both fitting and deeply ironic. Even in federal prison, she was using her intelligence and linguistic skills, though hopefully for purposes that wouldn't harm national security. "How are you doing, Vincent?" Sarah asked, her tone shifting from professional to personal. "Are you settling in well?" "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "I'm learning to enjoy the quiet." After we hung up, I remained on the deck as darkness settled over the water. A few miles across the bay, I could see the lights of small towns beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of salt water and the distant sound of waves against the shore. My neighbor Claire appeared at the edge of my property, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of easy smile that had nothing to hide behind it. "I saw you were on the phone," she called as she approached the deck. "I didn't want to interrupt, but I thought you might like some company for the sunset finale." "I'd like that very much," I said, taking the wine and finding glasses while she settled into one of the Adirondack chairs I had positioned to face the water. As we sat in comfortable silence, sharing wine and watching the last light fade from the sky, I thought about the Arabic phrase that had saved my life, the whispered plan for my death that I had understood purely by chance. If I hadn't learned that language during my military service 30 years earlier, if I had revealed my linguistic abilities to Angela at some point during our marriage, if I had chosen not to eavesdrop on what seemed like a private conversation, any number of small changes could have led to my death rather than my liberation. But instead, I was here, alive and free and surrounded by the simple pleasures of an honest life. The woman who had planned to murder me was spending her days in a federal prison cell while I was watching the sunset with a friend who knew my story and cared about my well-being without wanting anything from me except my company. "You're very quiet tonight," Claire observed, her voice gentle in the darkness. "Just thinking about how strange life can be," I said. 3 years ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future would look like. It never occurred to me that everything I believed about my life could be wrong. And now, I considered the question, looking out over the dark water where moonlight was beginning to create a silver path toward the horizon. Now I don't make assumptions about the future. I just try to pay attention to what's actually happening in the present. Claire reached over and touched my hand briefly, a gesture of comfort that carried no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive, no carefully planned manipulation. It was simply a human connection offered freely between two people who had both learned the hard way that life could change without warning. "That sounds like wisdom," she said. As we sat together in the peaceful darkness, I realized that while Angela's betrayal had cost me my marriage, my business, and my faith in my own judgment, it had also given me something unexpected: the ability to recognize and appreciate genuine honesty when I encountered it. The knowledge of Arabic that had saved my life had been a gift from my younger self to my older self, a skill acquired decades earlier that proved crucial at exactly the right moment. I was 62 years old, starting over in a way I had never imagined would be necessary. But I was starting over with a hard-earned understanding of the difference between love and manipulation, between trust and naivety, between the kind of peace that comes from ignorance and the kind that comes from acceptance of difficult truths. The evening breeze carried the sound of water lapping gently against the shore, a rhythm that had remained constant for thousands of years and would continue long after all our human dramas had been forgotten. In that rhythm, I found the peace that had been missing from my life for longer than I had realized. Not the false peace of a comfortable lie, but the true peace of finally understanding who I was and what I valued when all the illusions had been stripped away.